Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we're diving into the top 6 chess traps you absolutely need to know. These traps can help you to catch your opponent off guard. Let's jump right in. Number 6. The classical variation of the Sicilian defense. After knight to f6, attacking white's center, they defend. Black then plays pawn to d5. Wait, no, that's actually part of a special variation. The real classical variation happens after knight to b5 and pawn to d6. And that's where our trap begins. This is a common variation of the Sicilian defense, frequently played by top players. You continue with knight to d5, threatening knight to c7, which forks the king and rook. Black is forced to trade, and after pawn takes d5, their knight must retreat. Now you play pawn to c4, which seems like a simple move to strengthen your center. However, many opponents find your knight on b5 annoying and try to kick it away with pawn to a6, a standard idea seen in many openings, like the Ruy Lopez against a bishop on b5. But this seemingly natural move sets them up for your tactical strike. But in this case, pawn to a6 is a losing mistake. Instead of retreating your knight, you develop your queen, revealing that black's pawn is pinned and cannot capture. If they take your knight, they lose their rook. At this point, they realize your queen is also setting up discovered checks, like knight to c7. To block the threat, they naturally play bishop to d7, believing they have everything under control, especially since your knight is pinned. But there's one small detail they overlooked. You can simply play knight takes d6, checkmate. Number 5. After pawn to e4, a pawn to e5, we enter the two knights game. White now plays knight to f3, and black responds with knight to c6. White then plays bishop to c4, aiming for the fried liver attack. Normally, black counters with pawn to d5, but instead, you can shock your opponent with the unexpected move knight takes e4. This move surprises your opponent. Though white can capture with their knight or bishop, the position is trickier. Pawn to d5 lets you recover the piece, often gaining a better position. If white takes the pawn, thinking it forks your queen and rook, you respond with queen to h4, threatening checkmate and launching a strong attack. White struggles to defend, and you usually win. If white plays pawn to g3, you sacrifice your knight, exploiting the pin. White can't move their h-pawn or capture with the f-pawn without losing material. White's position collapses, and their defense crumbles. You play bishop to c5, forcing white's king to retreat. At this point, white's rook on h1 is no longer defended by their queen, allowing you to capture it with queen takes h1. You take the rook, keep attacking, and soon you pick up nearly all of white's pieces. The king has no safe squares to return to because queen to f2 would be checkmate. White is forced to move their king forward, leading to an exposed king versus an advancing queen, a position that heavily favors black. You have multiple winning ideas, relentlessly chasing the king into a losing position. For example, if white aggressively advances, hoping to lead their pieces into battle, fortune doesn't favor the bold. Number 4. We're ready to sacrifice our rook in the two knights game. After pawn to d5 and pawn takes d5, you strike with knight to d4. White likely pushes pawn to d6 to attack the f7 pawn, but this is where your tactics shine. White opens their position for an attack, but you ignore the threats and capture the pawn. Thinking they fork your queen and rook, white eagerly takes it, believing they gain an advantage. However, you calmly play queen to c6, and strangely enough, white actually loses. Their bishop is under attack, their g2 pawn is hanging, and even their rook is indirectly threatened. The bishop is also tied down because it must continue guarding the knight on f7. White realizes they cannot defend everything at once, so they decide to at least grab the rook, hoping to salvage something from the position. But after queen takes g2, you threaten to capture the rook, forcing white to move it to f1. Now, you strike with queen to e4, delivering check to the king. Notice that your knight controls the escape square, so white cannot block with their queen. They are forced to play bishop to e2, attempting to reinforce their position. Despite their best efforts to surround their king with defenders, you finish the game with a beautiful smothered checkmate. Number 3. We start with the usual moves. Pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, all standard opening theory. But instead of continuing normally, we enter the Ponziani opening with pawn to c3, preparing pawn to d4. If black plays knight to f6, we still push pawn to d4. While there could capture, many players hesitate, fearing that we will push forward and attack their knight. Instead, they often capture on d4, expecting you to recapture immediately. However, instead of taking back, you strike with pawn to d5, kicking their knight away. Once the knight retreats, you can now take the pawn on e5. leading to a well-known tactical trap. If black tries to counter by pushing pawn to d6, attempting to challenge your knight, they fall into a devastating tactic. Bishop to b5, check. At this point, black is in serious trouble. To block the check, they must sacrifice significant material, leaving them in a losing position. That's the first trap in this line. If black realizes pawn to d6 is a mistake, they may try a different approach, like moving their knight away. However, this disrupts their coordination, creating new tactical opportunities for white. Black might play knight to g6, and you strike with bishop to d3. It looks like a simple trade of knights, but if your opponent tries to be clever and grabs the pawn instead, thinking they get a better deal, a knight and a pawn for your knight, they walk right into your trap. They expect you to recapture normally, leading to a balanced position. Instead, you shock them with bishop takes g6, boldly sacrificing your queen. Black has no choice but to accept, or they would fall behind in material. If they capture with knight takes d1, you respond with bishop takes f7, launching a rapid attack on the exposed king. With no safe retreat, the king is forced forward. You continue with knight to c4, check, pushing the king up the board. As the king reaches c5, you might consider capturing their queen, but with the king so exposed, you must channel your inner Magnus Carlsen and look for checkmate. The winning move, knight to a3, completely trapping the king and sealing its fate. Your knight on a3 not only traps the king, but also supports the knight on c4, leaving black completely helpless. If black tries a move like queen takes g5, you deliver a beautiful finishing blow with pawn to b4, checkmate. Number 2, best opening for black against pawn to e4. Instead of traditional responses, you can go for pawn to f5, entering the rare and aggressive Russo gambit, a line with an incredibly high success rate. White often captures the pawn, believing it's an easy gain. However, you respond with pawn to e4, immediately pressuring their knight. Now white realizes their knight has no safe squares to move, and their only option is to awkwardly retreat to g1, a major setback. Instead of retreating, white might try to pin your pawn with queen to e2. But this only deepens the trap. You calmly play queen to e7, pinning their pawn on e4, making the threat undeniable. White is forced into a passive position, unable to recover. At this point, you continue with knight to f6, while white desperately tries to develop their misplaced knight. However, the pawn on e4 remains an obstacle, blocking their natural development. To resolve this, they might play pawn to d3, hoping to trade off pawns, exchange queens, and finally complete their development. But this is exactly where your attack explodes into action. You strike with knight to d4, forcing white's queen to move. And now, you unleash a brilliant combination, starting with knight takes c2, sacrificing your knight. White is forced to capture it, because if they don't, you will win their rook with a deadly fork. Once queen takes c2, you play pawn takes d3, delivering an incredibly rare and unusual discovered attack, winning white's queen instantly. Number 1, the Dutch defense, which is somewhat like a mirrored version of the Sicilian defense. Here you start with the obscure move pawn to h3, preparing pawn to g4. Black responds with knight to f6, a common move, but you go ahead with pawn to g4 anyway. This approach seems reckless, ignoring classical opening principles by not developing pieces or controlling the center. Instead, you launch an unconventional flank attack and sacrifice a pawn, which black's capture turns out to be a major mistake. Now, you play queen to d3, attacking the pawn twice, supported by your queen and rook. If black naturally defends with knight to f6, you ignore it and capture the pawn anyway, attacking the rook. If black recaptures the piece with either their knight or rook, you deliver queen to g6, checkmate,